Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I thought I would return to a previously quite popular topic, which is the current wave of industrial action happening in the UK, spearheaded by the unions. Now, I've talked about this before. This has generated some very interesting comments and some very useful insights actually from commentators on this channel. So please, if you do have inputs, please do put them into the comment section. Certainly last time they were interesting. So we're back to the conversations of union, and we're heading into popular themes such as the winter of discontent. There's a whole wave of strike actions in the public sector happening at the moment. But a question in my mind is, are they being effective? Are they going to actually succeed in their objectives? And this is an important and interesting question for me as a professional negotiator, because of course the whole point of me is to successfully negotiate an outcome for the people that I represent. So I thought I would take a bit of a dive into this. Now, this is a very political topic, so it's going to be impossible for me not to make certain political comments. But what I want to emphasize is that this is me coming at this as a negotiator rather than political commentary. I'm trying to establish how these succeed, all the pressures and negotiation strategies and so on being adopted. To do that, I am going to state certain political assumptions, and you will recognize them because they will be the more controversial statements in this video. However, as those in the channel will be familiar, I identify as politically independent or neutral, and I am trying to examine this purely from a negotiation perspective. So for anyone new to this channel, I am a professional negotiator with 10 years of experience, and I like to talk about current themes and how negotiation fits into that. So without further ado, let's talk about union strikes. So the first thing worth saying when talking about industrial action in the UK right now, that there's actually two completely different stories going on. One is public sector. That is in the news every day at the moment, and it's been going on for quite a while, in fact, a good chunk of this year. Various public sector bodies, let's include the railways in that for various reasons, lumped into that category. And the main reason why I say that is because they are going against the government. They are demanding pay rises from the government. So even if they actually work for a private company, think of them as a public sector, union pay dispute sort of thing. So let's, on the other side of the coin, however, the other story, are the unions representing those working in the private sector. Now, earlier on in the year, we started to have quite a few strikes. British Airways, in particular, had a fair few. Some of the bus companies had a few as well. And that's all gone pretty quiet now. And part of the reason for that is many of those disputes got settled before they even got to industrial action. And where they did go to industrial action, the unions and their employers were able to negotiate an outcome, a solution, relatively quickly. So there weren't that many strike days taken. So we got two very contrasting scenarios where the public sector strikes are going on and on and on, but the private sector ones are being resolved extremely quickly. And the thing is, there isn't a lot of difference between them. Both sides are being hit by inflation and cost of living, rise issues. And so the demands essentially are not particularly different. But how those demands are being dealt with and met is very different. And I think we can see that in that the private sector has been much more responsive, much more willing to recognise the issue and to work with the unions to try and agree a compromise solution. And I think we perhaps have to, acknowledge that they've been quite smart, the employers, in agreeing those solutions quickly, because many of those were agreed earlier on in the year before inflation really got to hit high, scary numbers. And everyone knew it was going to hit bad numbers, but they negotiated And what they did was they fixed the solutions for 2 or 3 years. So what that means is now that things are getting worse, the unions have secured a 2 or 3 year sort of fixed solution for their members. And so even though their members may not be getting money that's above the current rate of inflation, they are holding the line that they have agreed a deal and they should be sticking to it. So those private sector employers that agreed solutions early on have avoided this particular problem. They've avoided the demand becoming increased later on as inflation has gone to bite. So I think this is a very interesting case study in the fact that agreeing solutions early can actually be financially beneficial, or certainly more financially beneficial than delaying it. And I think this is perhaps where the public sector unions are. Everything has been delayed, and as a consequence of that, the demands have to be higher, the situation has to be resolved is worse, and so the government is even in a thornier position of meeting higher and higher demands. So before cracking on, let's do a quick recap on some of the key negotiation principles that underpin any kind of industrial dispute. First is these are adversarial style negotiation. So what that means is that the two or more parties that are attempting to negotiate do not have aligned interests. They want different things. So quite often in the case of industrial disputes, the unions representing their members want more pay, better terms and conditions, strengthened terms and conditions and so on, which can be a cost to the employer. By contrast, the employer does not want to be increase in pay. They might want more employment flexibility, such as the ability to fire or make redundant the workforce, and they might also want to water down some of those terms and conditions, which can be a cost of doing business. So when unions are negotiating with employers, I would always argue that they should be using a collaborative negotiation style, and if they have a good relationship, that is what they will do. But when they enter into the realms of industrial dispute, then they're indisputably very much on the adversarial side of the spectrum. So it's important to bear that in mind. Those unions who represent their members and never ever went into industrial action did so because they had a better relationship with the employer, were able to have a more collaborative negotiation where they could both sides took account of each other's views and reached a compromise. So industrial action is when that has failed, essentially, or never even started in the first place. So another hallmark of industrial action, of course, or these forms of negotiations, is that it's all about leverage. So a union is negotiating on behalf of its members because it has a large representation of workforce, it has numbers, those people are valuable, and so when the employer agrees a solution with the union, the employer is agreeing terms with one set of representatives that covers the vast majority of the workforce. If, by contrast, there are several unions, all with much smaller numbers, and they don't work together, don't agree, and that gives a little bit more leverage back to the employer because they can start to play them off against each other. The employer will also have a certain level of leverage in that they, of course, control the purse strings. But on the other hand, this is what industrial action really is about, that the unions have to find ways of applying pain back to the employer. Now this is where a negotiation concept of taking hostage comes into play. And it doesn't literally mean take the management hostage and hold them at gunpoint in the office. That's not at all what this means. What this means is that the unions, usually as a result of a ballot, will then withhold all their members' labour for a period of time. And they will do so in a way to cause the maximum damage to the employer, the maximum level of pain. That is their leverage. and the employer may try and return the damage in various different ways. But if it goes on for too long, then of course the company, the employer, starts to really suffer. So by taking hostage, it's about applying pain in a way to improve your negotiation position. Now, this is not the only way unions have negotiated this year, and there's been some very interesting development where the unions have gone outside of this traditional sort of withholding labour model and found other ways to apply leverage to employers. So a good example I've talked about before is the Unison Union, who, discovering that the bus company were bidding for contract in Norway, contacted their Norwegian counterparts and told them what a bad employer that particular company was and some of the bad practices that they had carried out in the UK. As a consequence of that, that significantly threatened the ability of that company to win a very big contract in Norway. Norway is very heavily unionised, and that has been very successful for their economic model. So as a consequence of applying that leverage, which is literally contacting Norwegian unions, the Unison union boss brought the bus company straight away to the negotiation table with a firm agreement never to carry out some of those bad practices again. They got what they wanted by doing that, by applying that form of leverage, which is a very interesting development, which leads me to the very interesting point that settlement is all about trying to reach your compromise on self-interest. So the union self-interest, of course, is that of their members, and the companies will not want to pick or really extend any kind of industrial dispute because of the damage it causes them. And if the union being really smart, then they will find some other creative ways of applying damage to that company or to the executive board or whatever of that organization. So when you're in this sort of adversarial acrimonious style of negotiation, self-interest becomes key. And it's not just about your own side self-interest, it's also about understanding the self-interest of the other side and targeting that as part of any negotiation strategy. So what that means as a final point, that's a hallmark of industrial action, is that third parties are being co-opted into negotiation to be involved in a way that has nothing to do with the core issue being negotiated. So in that example, Unison contacted Norwegian Union and co-opted them to support their negotiations. In the UK, more often than not, this is about using the media and political parties. And so part of the negotiation battle, if you like, is not just behind the doors, closed doors. It's also out in the open, and it's basically propaganda. It's basically media pieces, using journalists, using picket lines to get your message across, to co-opt the media, in turn to co-opt the electorate. Because industrial action is also about political pressure. It is not just about industrial or financial pressure, although more often than not that is the case for the private sector. That is not so much the case for the public sector. And it's important to bear this in mind because this is a key distinction for union activity, industrial action in the context of negotiation. So turning back to the public sector industrial dispute, we have to distinguish them from the private sector ones. And this is because even though the public sector and their unions are negotiating with the employers, whether that be rail companies, Network Rail, whether that be with the NHS or government departments or so on and so forth, the key distinction is that the employer does not have the power. So unlike in a private company, the boss of NHS or the boss of Network Rail doesn't necessarily have the authority to negotiate directly with the unions, reach a compromise, and then implement it. They quite often have to go and get approval from a government minister in order to reach that settlement. So in that context, we need to talk about the Conservative Party as basically the paymasters, because fundamentally they are the ones that get to decide whether any settlement can be agreed to. They get the final say, as it were, in the vast majority of cases, possibly all. I'm not entirely sure on that. So we sort of need to look at the Conservative Party and their role in these public sector industrial disputes and start to ask a few questions, really. And this could get somewhat interesting and perhaps a bit murky, to be honest. And politics is a dirty game. So this is why I said we can't take away the politics. So I suppose in some way we could have got to ask, do they actually want to recognise the concerns of the unions? At the end of the day, unions are asking for pay rises in the middle of a period of significant inflation, and they're asking for pay rises that help their members to meet the cost of living crisis. So if you put it that way, that doesn't sound particularly unreasonable. And whatever the numbers may be, you can obviously argue about what is a reasonable and not a reasonable number. Fundamentally, having your pay stay static, relatively speaking, is quite a concession. Normally people want pay to increase year on year, not to stay static. But the unions are coming at this very much from their members need big pay increases, not only because of the significant inflation this year, but also because of the significantly lower levels of pay rises that has happened in many preceding years. So as a standalone argument, that makes a lot of sense. But of course, in the context of a political argument, things tend to get a lot muddier. Now, I'm not going to go too much into that. This has been covered by various other people. But what we do need to ask is, does the Conservative Party really want to resolve these strikes? Because surely if they did, they already would have done. And there's been a lot of political commentary on this, that the Conservative Party seems to be gearing itself up to create a political fight here, because they feel that it is politically beneficial to do so, perhaps to invoke the era of Thatcher and union busting, or which may appeal to a certain core element of the Conservative vote. Maybe they do genuinely believe that there's not enough money in government coffers to settle all these issues, although of course that is difficult if they cannot delegitimise the claims of the unions that their people are suffering, particularly those on or near minimum wage. And the other thing also worth mentioning is that these strikes are extremely economically damaging to the country. They cause financial pain. That's the whole point of a strike. And if you are a union, you want to do industrial action at a time where you have most leverage, when it will cause the most pain to the employer. That is just negotiation common sense. So in this context, the government should be acting like the private sector and seeking to minimise the economic pain, particularly when you have a country going into recession. But we do not seem to be having that sort of narrative. The Conservative Party does not seem, although they seem to have done that fairly quickly with the barristers, interestingly enough, but not so much with all the others. So we're kind of forced to ask ourselves a little bit, is how important is politics in terms of this negotiation? And will the politics trump common sense, trump economic damage limitation? And fundamentally, will the Conservative Party agree, or Rishi Sunak maybe and his ministers, let's put it down to them, will they actually agree to any compromise at all, or will they only want the unions to capitulate, which is a very dangerous strategy? I will leave with a few final thoughts on this section, because this is important for the unions. If you're approaching a negotiation imagining that the rules of the game are per normal, you're going to use leverage, you're going to apply pain until the other side agrees to a compromise, settlement with you, then that's based on certain assumptions. That's based on the assumption that the other side will actually compromise to an agreeable point. If the Conservative Party or Rishi Sunak and the Cabinet Office will never compromise to an agreeable point, then the union may need to change their strategy, their industrial strategy, industrial action. And so the final point I will leave on that, these are the political assumptions I'm going to make about going forward, which I won't cover in too much detail because I've done that in previous video. Firstly, the modern day Conservative Party and many of the government ministers and former government ministers in the backbench of the Conservative Party have killed more UK citizens in the last 20 years through austerity measures, benefits changes and so on, than the last 20 years of terrorist action, for example. So let that sink in for a bit. You've got a group of people who have quite willfully, indifferently, caused the death of a lot of UK citizens. And they justify that as being economically necessary, politically necessary, whatever it may be. This can be obviously argued. I'm not going to do that here. But that is the actual reality. It's been documented that they have caused all those deaths. Now, in previous videos, I've talked about the fact that the Conservative Party, and here's another political assumption, is the most corrupt political party in the UK. And corruption is not just about money, it corrupts the way you think. So what this means is that the Conservative Party has a very warped way at looking how they carry out policies and economic and political activities, how they make policies, government policies. They don't mind collateral damage. And that's not just about people's lives, it's also about the economics. Because the economic data is very clearly showing that recent government policies, at least the last 3 years, if not the last 6 years, have caused a huge amount of economic damage to the UK, particularly in terms of Brexit policy. And again, I'm not going to go into the political argument here. I am merely stating that when you're negotiating against people who you believe have a very warped view of how things work, then playing by gentlemen's and friendly rules perhaps isn't going to get you your negotiation objective. If you're trying to apply economic pain in order to secure a negotiation outcome, and the other side simply doesn't care because they don't mind economic pain being applied to the country, they've been doing it themselves for several years, they don't mind people suffering, they don't mind people dying, they will justify it because they have already done so for many years. Then an industrial action that relies upon those normal leverages it's going to be tricky. So really you're down to trying to apply political pain to the Conservative Party rather than to traditional economic pain if the unions wish to try and secure an outcome. And this is an important question. Is that genuinely what the union is trying to do? Are the unions trying to pick a fight with the Conservative Party, or are they trying to get pay rises for their members? And unfortunately, the line between those two different questions, or the two different arguments, if you like, isn't very clear, because the Conservative Party is very happy to go and pick a political fight rather than to reach a settlement. And this has to be acknowledged as a key distinction as to why we have so much public sector industrial action going on right now. So when asking the question, how do the unions win this industrial action, whatever your definition of winning looks like, they kind of got to make a choice. The unions can continue as they are, applying pain to the economy and applying pain to their employer whilst trying to win the political and media battle against the Conservative Party, and to keep on going and going until one side or the other breaks. That is one option that they have and seems to be the current option being pursued. But there's another option, and this is where I talk about co-opting of third parties and going outside of the negotiation in order to improve your negotiation position, which is quite a common tactic if you have the weaker position. Now, in this tactic, I'm talking about the union directly targeting Conservative ministers. Now, before I continue, I'm going to put a couple of important caveats out there. In no way, shape or form do I condone any violence applied to politicians, as much as we might dislike or hate them. There should never be any violence to any politician. So that is not what I'm talking about here, and I don't endorse that at all. Make that clear up front. The second thing, again, is nothing illegal here. Some of the stuff I'm talking about here can be seen as unethical, immoral, unpleasant. You can use all those words. But again, I do not endorse doing anything illegal. So by that, you don't do these things as a blackmail thing. You literally just do them to apply pressure. And there is a difference. Blackmail is obviously you try and threaten someone, not with the goal of carrying it out. Whereas applying pressure or leverage is you just carry out the action because you're trying to put pressure on the other side. So in this case, when I'm saying time to get personal, I am talking about the unions directly applying pressure onto Conservative ministers, particularly those who sit in the cabinet. Now, part of the political assumption underpinning this is, as regular people on this channel will know, my opinion is that the Conservative ministers are very compromised, shall we say, whether that's in financial terms, whether that's in their moral ethic, whether there's allegations of bullying, just their sheer stupidity. There's a whole bunch of people with a lot of skeletons in their closet, shall we say. A lot of issues that brought to the fore will undermine them publicly. So this is one of the options that the union can pursue as part of their industrial dispute. They could seek to, so let's imagine, the Minister for Health, whoever it is, I can't remember who it is at this point, I think it's Stephen Barclay. Let's imagine he's taken money. Let's imagine he's done lots of lobbying. What the unions can seek to do, and this is part of the co-opting the media to win the media war, is talk about it. They can be sitting on the picket lines, and they can say, yeah, we're trying to negotiate with a health secretary who has taken, X thousands from private health companies. He doesn't want to negotiate because he had a conflict of interest where he is taking money from them. And literally just put it out there all the time. So what you're doing, now I say, it's important to stress, I'm not saying make things up, far from that. Take whatever the truth is out there and weaponize it. And there's plenty of, those who read the proper press, the journalists, the investigative journalists who investigate these things. There's plenty of this information out there for the unions to access if they want to. So far, they have not used that information. They've not gone out, hunted it, and sought to personally undermine government ministers. This is one of the options they can pursue. They can literally go out there and say, these ministers are bent. And that is why they won't agree to a reasonable settlement with us. And they should say that on a picket line in front of the media every single opportunity you can get MPs to raise that in Parliament, literally just create pressure on the minister. No one likes being called a bent politician, so make sure they're called a bent politician publicly daily. It applies pressure. Like I've said, also, a lot of those MPs are personally compromised. There's things that they have done that probably are illegal, whether that's to do with campaign finance or corruption or some of the where their sources of money comes from. So again, an option for the union is to find out that sort of stuff and then to make formal complaints and referrals to the appropriate bodies, whether that be the police, standards committees, whoever. And again, this is another underhand means by which they could be applying pressure specifically onto the ministers to really make them feel extremely uncomfortable where they are. Because it's very hard to do your job well if you have a whole host of other questions being asked about your personal integrity. Of course, we know that a lot of ministers have outside interests. This is perhaps a debate for another day. Other people call that corruption or conflicts of interest. And again, another strategy that unions could adopt is to talk about their employers. So if the Minister for Health, for example, had payment, lobbying payment, whatever the hell they are, from a company, name check that company. Again, put them in the media, say, yeah, they're taking money from these people. We think it is corrupt. Embarrass the people who pay the ministers as well as the ministers themselves. If that is done successfully, then those companies might start to withdraw, pull up, cancel their contract, stop paying those ministers. Immediately, they start to feel financial pain as a consequence of this. Now, this is dirty tactics. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. And I'm also, but politics is a dirty game. And I think we can see that Conservative Party media machine is attempting to use some of these tactics on the union leaders, particularly the likes of Mick Lynch. You can see quite a lot of that starting to happen. So far, the unions, let's say by extension, Labour, and the media outlets who are supportive of the unions and or Labour, have not returned the favour. This is one option that the unions can use to really escalate things, because at the end of the day, the argument being made here that applying pain directly to their employers is not working. They need to apply the pain to the people who ultimately make the decisions. Now, if those people are not willing to be reasonable and make logical decisions or have a negotiation in good faith, then there's a bunch of underhand tactics that are quite normal in politics that they can use. So it'll be very interesting to see if the union decide to go down this route, if they decide to actually fatally undermine bits of the Cabinet Office. And they would do so deliberately to try and improve their negotiation position. They don't just have to go after the minister that they're negotiating with, they can literally just go after any minister in the Cabinet. And if they can pick them off one by one through complaints, pressure, formal grievances, make them hate their job and quit, whatever it may be, the new ministers that take over will be becoming increasingly reluctant to confront the unions because of the personal cost that it will be taking on them. This improves the ability of the unions to reach a better pay supplement for their members. Like I said, not necessarily a nice tactic, but in negotiation terms, this may be something that they may judge as worth pursuing. Now, the union don't have to go after individual ministers. They could decide to go after the Conservative Party as a whole. And there's a few little things that they can aim for here. I mean, the Conservative Party has a whole host of scandals and skeletons lurking around in its closet. So, for example, all the political donations from Russian oligarchs, all the donations from individuals or companies that coincidentally lead to government policies that benefit them. And so some of the options that, again, the unions can apply here, similar to what they could do to individual ministers, is to start publicly name-checking all those donors and every media interview they can get on the picket line, literally make it part of the national conversation. In short, what they could be trying to do is embarrass those people who support or donate to the Conservative Party. Now, if they're able to successfully pursue that kind of strategy, again, that starts to cause significant political and financial damage to the Conservative Party. I mean, the Conservative Party is already pretty toxic as far as the UK electorate is concerned. Obviously, there's a chunk of the UK electorate that will vote Conservative no matter what. But the swing voters, and even quite dedicated traditional Conservative voters, do not like reading about scandals and corruption and party donors and kickbacks and all the other bits and pieces. So one of the options for the union, again, to strengthen the negotiation hand, is to basically declare general war on the Conservative Party and at every opportunity possible, publicly embarrass them, make their brand even more toxic than it already is. And quite apart from applying pressure across the board against the Conservative Party, it will cause things like their membership numbers to drop, their political donations possibly to drop, as people just... Donors don't like being publicly embarrassed. That's one of the things about wealthy people. They like to stay kind of private and behind the scenes. So the unions wanted to, they could just name them constantly. Did you know so-and-so gave X million to the Conservative Party in return for, presumably, whatever kickback? And they can keep hammering that message out as part of their industrial action. Get it into the media, get it into the public consciousness. And at which point, the Conservatives suddenly find that this political battle that they wish to pursue with the unions is suddenly becoming extremely politically and financially costly to them. At which point, again, one assumes they might become more willing to reach a more immediate settlement with the unions in order to stop all this negative messaging from going out. And I take the view that the Conservative Party are quite vulnerable to this line of attack. The only reason why they're not been not been subjected to it is because a large chunk of the media, particularly the print media, is deliberately not reporting all these issues. But the unions have their own ability to get the message out, whether that perhaps with other media or through internal pamphlets or just sitting in front of the TV camera or attending question time debate. They have their own means of doing this. The reason why they're not is because it is not a coordinated, it's not a concerted action plan. All the union leaders, all the union members, they're not being briefed to do this. By contrast, Conservative ministers, Conservative MPs are being briefed and given lines to take to attack the unions on, which they're deploying every time they go on the radio, onto the TV and so on. The unions so far have only held fire and talked about their disputes, their members, with a little bit of politics thrown in, but not that much. They've not all coordinated and gone on this attack. And this is one of the options that is open for them if they really want to escalate things very significantly and cause a considerable amount of pain to the Conservative Party. Because if they did that, then that can improve their negotiation position. This is co-opting third parties to strengthen your position at the negotiation table. This is not an easy strategy, not a pleasant strategy, but it's politics. And it's the politics that's already being used by the Conservative Party. The question is, will the unions respond to this, or will they carry on playing as they have done? So my final remarks on this video. People will be aware that I always ask this question: what is the objective you're trying to achieve? And so in some ways I would have to ask this question of the union. What is the objective that they are trying to achieve? Are they solely trying to get better pay deal for their members? And probably by and large they are. That's probably the case. But also, do they mind, or they seek as an objective, to damage the Conservative Party? In other words, a bit of class war. Now, strictly speaking, those two should be completely different objectives with completely different strategies. Unfortunately for the unions, it is not that clear cut. The Conservative Party have gone down the class war route. That part is obvious. You can see that that is their negotiation strategy. They're trying to win the media battle. They're doing the dirty tactics. And they're playing to that because they believe that is their strength. They believe they can win that battle by playing the class war. They cannot win the industrial or economic battle negotiating directly with the unions because they don't have a good, robust argument. So they're switching it. So now in the normal run of things, you would have thought the union would just stick to their strength, stick to the argument that that is most in their favour. Unfortunately, this is politics, and rational and common sense doesn't always apply. So in seeking to achieve a pay deal for their members, unions may be forced into playing this class war with the Conservative Party in order to achieve that objective. And by the way, perhaps as a happy coincidence, trashing the Conservative Party and causing significant collateral damage if they play it. But at this point, the Conservative Party see themselves as better at this, and if the unions want to meet them on this particular battleground, they're going to have to improve their messaging and how they carry out their negotiation, how their strategies are pulled together. Or they just carry on as they are, hoping that in the long term they will win. That is the decision that they will have to make as part of trying to get these industrial disputes resolved. Now, I'm working the assumption that their goals are to resolve industrial disputes rather than to start a political war, but I could be wrong. Maybe their objective really is to have a political battle, try and win the hearts and minds of the countries more in favour of unionism. So we shall see. But what cannot be disputed is that this is going to cause a lot of damage. And the problem is that it very much underlines just how difficult it is to negotiate with somebody who does not want to negotiate, and certainly not on fair and equal terms. So when that sort of thing happens, then and this is in a whole range of negotiations. You'll see this particularly at government level negotiations. If you're not able to get the other side to come to your position during negotiation, you go outside that negotiation. You find other people that can apply pressure on the other side. And in this particular context, the pressure points are things like the media. Everyone thinks about that as part of industrial disputes. But what people forget, that other pressure points could be the justice system, the parliamentary system, other standard systems, even just other people completely unrelated to the dispute who, for example, happen to pay, whether through donations or salary, political entity, ministers and MPs. Those are all potential pressure points that people can go outside negotiation to try and apply in order to gain leverage. So I thought I wanted to make that point, that if you get a little bit creative in negotiation, when you're in a weak position, there's actually a surprising amount you can do. Now, I don't pretend that is easy. I don't pretend that is ethical or a nice thing to do. I'm just saying there's plenty of times I have seen that done by other people. And so it's worth considering this in the context of the industrial dispute. And so my final point, I suppose, on this, in that this is an adversarial stroke very destructive negotiation between political figures, I suppose, maybe that's not too loose a definition. No one ever comes out great in a destructive form of negotiation. I'll use an analogy. Think of a divorce on two sides, and instead of trying to amicably resolve the divorce sentiment, they destructively go at each other and just rack up legal fees, trying to improve their negotiation position part of the divorce settlement. Think of it in that term. That is the potential for what can happen between the unions and the Conservative Party. And there are never any particular winners from that sort of scenario. So for me, it's a very destructive, very poor form of negotiation. Unfortunately, some people just want to do it. They want to negotiate that way. And so this is an important thing for anyone who is a professional negotiator. You have to recognize when you're in that kind of negotiation. You have to find strategies that can get you out of that particular situation. Some of those strategies may be rather underhand. Some may be more direct or more indirect. I mean, a direct approach, you can just walk away. But in this case, the union walk away does not help their members. So it's a bit of a difficult situation. And I think the level of economic and political pain or fallout that will come from this industrial action will have repercussions for the UK as a whole for a considerable period of time. So interesting as I find all this, I don't necessarily welcome it because I think it's harmful, in short. And again, who you blame for causing the harm is perhaps a matter of your political viewpoint. So I won't delve further into that. But I hope you have found this insight helpful. I hope it helps you to understand some of the negotiation dynamics at play. And I look forward to seeing some of the comments in the comments box below. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoy this content.